Today we have a tiny update on the situation when it comes to Mythic Plus. At the end of the day, yes, you might be raiding, you might be doing either Heroic or even Mythic now in this second week of 10.2 of Season 3, but you know, you are gonna be spending more time very likely inside a Mythic Plus jail cell, or I mean inside a Mythic Plus dungeon. So we have gone through Fortified last week, and this week we have now been a couple of days, a bit over a couple of days for NA into Tyrannical. So let's look at some numbers, let's look at some of the results of this first couple of weeks, less so when talking about meta, okay? We're not today here to talk about, you know, Vengeance being the S tier tank, or Discipline for the healers, or Augmentation and BM and Havoc for the DPS, etc, etc. We're talking more about things like dungeons, for example. We are talking about the difficulty of the dungeons, not just from this current week, but also from last week, for example. This obviously was the first week, meaning many players were jumping into dungeons, completely YOLOing every single mechanic, not really knowing much of anything when it came to how to deal with certain things, for example. So we saw the results of the dungeons immediately showing what was going to be likely the easiest dungeon of the season, perhaps not quite at Shadow Moon Burial Grounds level of easy, but still a good amount easier than the rest, which was Atadazar. Atadazar, which you can also see from the total score in itself, having way more 22, 23 and 24 keys completed compared to the second and then third and then fourth and even all the way lower down when there were barely any 23 keys completed. You know, when one dungeon has 183 plus 23 is completed and the other one has 13, you kind of get the idea of the level of difficulty of the two dungeons. So we ended week 1 with Atadazar and Everbloom as our easiest dungeons in Fortified, with Throne of the Tides and Dawn of the Infinite, the Murzond part of the dungeon, being the two hardest one, with a quite significant gap for Murzons, less than 50% of ease of completion. Now, comparing Tyrannical and Fortified this early in the season is obviously going to skew things heavily for Tyrannical. That's because this week many players have jumped 10, 15, maybe even 20 item levels compared to last week, meaning of course that in general the plus 17 to plus 21 range of keys has become much easier this week, meaning that completing the key in Tyrannical compared to Fortified has gotten easier. Unsurprisingly, the couple of dungeons which remained easier on Fortified compared to Tyrannical were also a couple of the dungeons which received buffs on the difficulty of their bosses. For example, Atadazar. Atadazar received nerfs to the trash mobs as well as buffs, making two of their bosses harder. So it does make more sense, for example, for Atadazar to remain easier on this week. Now, talking about the dungeons themselves, when you move from, of course, Fortified to Tyrannical, the percentage start going up by quite a bit. For example, we no longer have a 47% for Murzon's Rise, we are all the way up to 67%. So now the success rate of each dungeon is way more within a closer gap from one another, with the newly dungeon boss buffed Atadazar now being significantly lower than before and no longer the clear easiest one. Right now that spot is taken by Blackroot Hold and even by Wakecrest Manor when it comes to Tyrannical. It also does help that these two affixes are reasonably easy when it comes to the week. Of course, even easier when it comes to Tyrannical. Bursting is not really going to be a thing in a boss fight, and then Entangling is amongst the least problematic of the affixes, even though yes, there can be some mechanics on some bosses where if the Entangling procs suddenly, you can be kind of screwed. In general, it's a reasonably decent affix to deal with for the majority of the other bosses. So with this, we have a kind of already evenly balanced spread of difficulty. This is nothing like the nightmares of the past, even starting from season 1 of Dragonflight. I don't want to trigger any kind of PTSD for any of you, but if you remember the pre-nerf versions of dungeons like Ruby Life Pools, dungeons like the Nokud Offensive, things like the 3 boss in Algetar Academy before the nerfs, etc, etc, you know, those were much lower down in terms of chance of success very early on in the season. You can look also at the specs themselves in terms of the success rate. It can give you an idea of how meta a spec is. For example, here you see Discipline being first, which isn't really that relevant. What is more relevant is that it is first despite having way higher amount of runs than the rest. If you are ever used to play competitive games where you have to look at the power of certain champions, the power of certain characters, you generally want to see the characters with the highest play rate be not nearly as successful, because it means they are played by way more casuals, way less experienced players, because they are the flavor of the month, so their success rate goes down. Inversely, you want to see the niche, the hipster picks having much higher success rates, because it means they are played by experts, they are played by diehard fans and enjoyers of that character or that hero or champion or whatever. So seeing a situation where the most popular pick is also the one with the highest success rate does give you an idea of the meta level of Discipline. Same can be said for Vengeance. You know, Vengeance here is basically almost tied with Protection and Guardian, but the difference though is the play rate. Way less Guardian Druids are playing with the same success rate of Vengeance at the moment. And then you move over, of course, to the much larger list of DPS specs. In here the numbers are a bit more wild, because for healers we had a 6-ish% gap, for tanks we had a very small 2.4% gap in terms of success rate, but for the DPS we can go as far down as 10+% in terms of difference. Obviously, the lowest one down at the moment being Marksmanship Hunter, far lower down than anyone else. I like this list because it properly highlights the misfortunes of Subtlety Rogue, where we do see the rogue with the highest success rate, but at the same time with one of the smallest amount of runs, right over here, which is consistent with the rankings in Mythic Plus, where you see Subtlety being the least played out of all of the rogues, and yet their numbers are pretty good, but in terms of play rate is not really having much of any success when you consider the popularity of both Assassination and of Outlaw. You can also see it here pointed out by the average score of the key. They do clear on average lower level keys than both Assassination and Outlaw. Definitely unsurprising in this matter of high keys to see some of these specs much lower down than the rest. Specs like Marksmanship, Affliction, Survival, both of the Death Knight specs, and the other of the weak Warlock specs being far lower down than these gang of top specs right now in Mythic Plus. You can also see their popularity reflected in the amount of runs. There is only one spec that is out of frame in these popular ones when it comes to the average score. As you scroll down, you find the odd one out, which is Beast Mastery. You know, Beast Mastery is hanging around specs with 1.5, 2.8, 1.3, 1.2, 700, and then you have a 16,000 Beast Mastery Hunter not clearing nearly as high on average of a level of keys than the rest. This is likely to do with the usual thing when it comes to Beast Mastery Hunters, that they are very popular as a spec, regardless of their power level. Both in the raid and in Mythic Plus, there are just very many players who tend to play Beast Mastery Hunter. So it also makes more sense that Beast Mastery Hunter, while being meta and also still being meta at the high end, they might not have these type of shiny scores when it comes to the overall player base due to how much they are being played. And also technically because right now, if we are to look at the absolute highest keys done at the moment, we don't actually see many Beast Mastery Hunters. We have 1, we have 2, we have 3 in the top 40. We can keep scrolling down. You see 3 more, you know, 3 more in the top 80. That's 6 hunters in the top 80. And we can finish with 7, 8, 9 hunters in the top 100. So in the top 100, you have 300 DPS being picked, and 10 of them are Beast Mastery hunters. So despite not even being that prevalent in the very top keys, they are still a super popular spec together with Havoc. With the only difference, of course, that Havoc is also leading the high success rate chance of keys, it's also leading the average score of keys, and it's also leading in terms of being present in the majority of the very high keys. As you can see, purple is pretty much in borderline every single key when it comes to high level compositions of groups in Mythic Plus. Talking about the high level of groups and the composition of the groups, you can look right here for the most popular comps in Mythic Plus right now. We can start with first week. So right as the season began, we saw the absolute dominance already from week 1, so no misunderstandings whatsoever. Vengeance was the #1 tank. It was more, and it still is, more of a debate when it comes to the healers. Discipline is definitely the main pick, but it's also followed by Holy and Restoration Druid. For the DPS, Havoc was also from day 1 the clear choice. It's present in every single, literally, every single one of the top 10 most popular groups. Outlaw is also following, although not nearly as popular as Havoc Demon Hunter. Same goes for Augmentation Evoker. Looking over at the second week with Tyrannical now, there has been some slight changes. We have seen, for example, Vengeance now having more room for other tanks here and there. Restoration Druid seems to have taken over the spot of Holy Paladin, and while Havoc Demon Hunter has remained present in every single group, Outlaw Rogue has not. That's one of the main changes compared to last week, compared to the first week of the season. Same goes for Augmentation. Seems like they are... The idea that an Augmentation Evoker is a must-have is definitely not nearly as much of a certainty as before. Even if you look at the high keys right here, the color of Augmentation is definitely present in quite a lot of keys, but, you know, there's 1, there's 2, there is 3, there is 4, and then there is 5, and then there is 6, and then there is 7, and then there is 8, there is 9, there is 10, there is 11, there is 12, 13, and 14. So 14 in the top 40, which is a good 30+% of top keys not even having an Augmentation Evoker. Perhaps we have just reached the breaking point in the amount of nerfs needed to not make Augmentation a must-have when it comes to Mythic Plus, at the very least. It's good to check these type of things right now, the situations in the dungeons right now, just to see how things will progress deeper down the season, both in terms of the compositions of the groups themselves, as well as the difficulty of the dungeons over time, over different weeks, in terms of affixes, as well as over different sets of balance tuning that might make a dungeon easier, like in the case of something like the nerfed Turn of the Tides, or harder, like in the case of the buffed Atal Dazar. So this is the recap as far as Mythic Plus is concerned for this second week of Season 3, awaiting any further changes down the line. We're going to stop for today on this Thursday with this Mythic Plus recap, and we're going to start by saying our goodbyes to all, of course, of the dear Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these superfluous things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, just in time, I had planned to finish this and have enough time to go shop for some groceries before raid time, and I'm about 3 minutes ahead of schedule. So, great.